happy today to have in our midst Professor Indranil Acharya, one of my illustrious contemporaries, from Vidyasagar University. He teaches English at Vidyasagar University, and today he is going to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. He is going to talk about the literature of the marginalized. And surprise, surprise, he has chosen to talk about the Indian context. So this lecture, as we can very easily understand, is going to talk about not only the theoretical formulation of marginality and its representation in literature. He is going to give you palpable textual instances that will really help us in making sense of the theoretical constellation that he is going to come up with. So without further ado, let me now hand over the reins of this program to the capable hands of my friend, Professor Indranil Acharya. It's over to you, Indranil.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Professor Amit Bhattacharya. And I'm really grateful to the Department of English, University of Gaur Bongo, for inviting me to this lecture series, online lecture series. And really, it's a pleasure for me to give a talk on the issue of literature of the marginalized in the Indian context. As you know that in Vidyasagar University, Department of English, we have been conducting research on the language and literature of the marginalized people, especially in the Indian context, since 2008-9. So it's almost for the last 12 years that we have been engaged in theoretical deliberations and also close textual readings, documentation, translation, and analysis of different types of marginalized literature in the Indian context. Not only that, our research has also opened up a comparatist framework with other specimens of marginalized literature worldwide. In fact, we have focused on Australian Aboriginal literature. We have also focused on African literature and African American protest literature and several other literatures of protest, literatures from the margins, which in a way provide an excellent comparatist framework for a better understanding of the nature and extent of marginalization in the Indian context. In fact, my talk today is inspired to a large extent by the findings which we have come across during our research surveys, research analysis, and close textual readings of marginal works of literature over the last 12 years. The title of my talk, as Amit has already stated, Literature of the Marginalized, a study in the Indian context, would definitely give rise to a curiosity about the nature of the marginalized. Who are these marginalized people? Whose literature are we going to talk about? How do they constitute this discourse of marginality? And what type of literature are they producing over the last few decades? And why are they marginalized? What is their relationship vis-a-vis the mainstream majoritarian literature? And in a way, what are the uncharted territories of marginalized writing, which in our pedagogical engagement with literature, particularly in English studies, we have often overlooked or we have not yet been able to offer in the curriculum. So there are many questions and there will be many divergent responses. I know that because this is also a hugely contested territory, especially the construct of marginality, the construct of marginalized people, the nature and extent of marginalization. And I know that there is a relative ever changing goalpost, and which is difficult to fix and formulate. And in a way, that is also a very good mark of you know continuously evolving kind of research and engagement with the idea of marginality. And especially in the pandemic universe, we have come up with new notions of marginality and marginalization. We have come up with new sections of marginalized people. Okay, we have learned to come across, we have learned to cope with new kinds of untouchability. And in a way, in the new normal era, we have been confronted with many new definitions and descriptions of marginality and say marginalized people. So my first proposition is this, that literature of the marginalized, or even if we say literature from the margins, literature of the margins, literature by the margin, whatever, literature of the marginalized should not be equated with post-colonial literature, that broad generic rubric, because of certain assumptions, certain experiences, certain lived experiences, and perceptions, which definitely aim at a new kind of construct, which is not absolutely equated, which cannot be absolutely equated with the notion of post-colonial literature, quote unquote, as we are familiar with. So in a way, we are talking about a third dimension. Okay, we are definitely talking about a fourth world. Okay, and we are going to engage with very specific kinds of marginality or marginalization. Okay, as we are talking of this concept more than 70 years after Indian independence. So it's not enough, it's not adequate rather to address this literature of the marginalized, okay, merely with the rubric of post-colonial literature. So marginalized people have been and still are socially, economically, politically, and legally ignored. We know that they are excluded and therefore vulnerable to livelihood change. And we have seen in the media the vulnerability of these marginalized people, especially the migrant laborers, whom we have seen in the media during the early stages of the lockdown. Okay, how vulnerable they were to the sudden livelihood changes, to the sudden changes in their options of livelihood. And we have witnessed, we have come across, okay, the great human tragedies on the road, on the railway track, okay, for these migrant laborers, for these marginalized people. So in a way, it's still very relevant in 2020 to talk about the exclusion. And in a way, the internal schism and colonial conquest, if we look at the root of the colonial invasion, the colonial conquest, and the colonial domination over the Indian subcontinent, we find how marginalization within marginalization, this is actually not my coinage, these are the coinages of many social scientists, okay, which became the cause of British rule. In fact, I refer to Karl Marx, okay, who raised this pertinent question, how was English supremacy established in India? Okay, and Marx continues that the country was not only divided between Hindus and Muslims, it was also divided between tribe and tribe, between caste and caste. There were many internal schisms. In fact, we know in 2020 that there is no homogeneous concept of Indian tribes or even no homogeneous concept of Indian castes. Okay, it is fractured within. Okay, there are many internal fissures, okay, gaps and conflicts which we find even within the tribal communities, okay, or even the Dalit communities. So the division was important. The schism was a major cause for the establishment of the colonial supremacy. Okay, such a country and such a society, Marx says, that was a predestined prey of conquest. Now, if we look at the definition of marginalization, because it is important to define marginalization in the Indian context, in any talk on marginalization, that is essential. And if you follow, Merriam-Webster dictionary, you would find it's defined as marginalization means to relegate to an unimportant or powerless position within a society or a group. So relegating to an unimportant or powerless position. So marginalization is the result of the continual struggle for the capturing of power. Okay, and the resultant, state of powerlessness for a particular group, which is unable to compete with the dominant discourse of a particular period of time. In fact, if we move on to another definition by International Geographical Union, okay, it defines marginalization as, I quote, the temporary state of having been put aside, of living in relative isolation. That is important. Isolation, because marginalization has got to do with geographical isolation, away from the mainstream, a kind of ghettoization, okay, a kind of fixing them within a space, a kind of prisoners of space, spatial marginalization. I will come to that point later. Living in relative isolation, and if you look at the denotified and nomadic tribes, the nature of their movement, the plight of their existence in the 2020, you will find how this is very true in the case of the DNTs and hundreds of nomadic tribes in the Indian context, living in relative isolation at the edge of system, cultural, social, political, or economic. And also there is an isolation in mind when one excludes certain domains or a phenomenon from one's thinking because they don't correspond to the mainstream philosophy. In fact, we know, if we look at the history of colonial production of knowledge, we find how there was an exclusivist practice of constructing new knowledge for the colonized people, as if the colonized people were ahistorical beings without any history of their own, and how there was a construction of a new history, and with the help of the new sciences like anthropology, and how there was a kind of a very neat pseudoscientific kind of classification of Indian tribes and Indian marginalized population, okay, so as to achieve complete control, total control over the marginalized population. So in a way, it's a kind of politics which we have found, okay, during the colonial period, and even in the post-colonial era, we find the continuity of such discriminatory practices, which in a way inspire deliberate exclusion of certain classes of people, certain sections of people, certain sections of ideas, okay, ideologies, and in a way it creates a kind of mainstream majoritarian, a kind of supremacist kind of idea, which clearly excludes the so-called quote unquote aberrant voices, okay, in a way the divergent voices, and wants to achieve a kind of monolithic state of existence, which is quite apparent and evident in any serious engagement with modern 21st century sociological study. In fact, in the next slide, I have looked at two conceptual frameworks of marginalization. One is the societal marginalization, another one is the spatial marginalization. In fact, societal marginalization depicts broad human dimensions of stratification. There are parameters like caste, class, gender, ethnicity, and in a way they are also intertwined as a very inclusive, complex kind of perception. Say caste, class, gender, ethnicity are also rolled into one, so they are not watertight compartments. If you think of, say, a tribal woman or a Dalit woman, okay, you would find how the caste, class, gender, and even in the case of the tribal woman ethnicity, okay, all such parameters in a way overlap and intertwine in a very complex structure, and which is very difficult to segregate and very difficult to, in a way, explain in a clear-cut manner. So it studies factors responsible for the exclusion, so social inequality and social injustice. And when we talk about spatial marginalization, we find it depicts separation of people, social stigma. Yes, okay, I will be talking about the ex-untouchable communities. I'll be talking about the nomadic tribes, the ex-criminal tribes. Okay, and I will be talking about how there had been a deliberate segregation of certain sections of people, and there had been an attachment of social stigma to their identity, and how there had also been, okay, an inward silent operation of gender stratification and other kinds of stratification, okay, which have completely marginalized these people, spatially. And this territorial marginalization is once again a great marker of disempowerment of these marginalized people. In fact, in the Indian situation, we find in India groups are marginalized on the basis of social, cultural, ethnic, economic. Okay, I have already mentioned these factors. Who are the marginalized groups? Okay, the Dalits, the tribals, even the Muslims, the poor people, the economically backward, the physically disadvantaged, the disabled people, differently abled people, okay, and the LGBT, and many other groups are there, okay, who belong to this marginalized, okay, domain of existence. So they become victim of crisis of identity. So that is a major issue, because we find that the identity of many of these Indian marginalized people, okay, is severely endangered. In many cases, it is even critically endangered. There is a problem in reclamation of identity. There is a problem of, severe loss of human rights. Okay, and that we observe in the case of many communities, marginalized communities in the Indian context. It keeps the groups away from decision-making abilities and power. Okay, so they have voting rights, but they cannot decide, okay, anything about their own existence, about their own growth and development, about their own happiness and well-being. So they are completely disempowered, although they are citizens of this democratic nation. And if we look at another thing, when we want to theorize, marginalization, okay, we have to definitely apply the theoretical formulations we find in the domain of social science, especially sociology, sociological approach to marginalization. We find there is a theory of social stratification. In fact, the theory of social stratification is eminently applicable to the Indian situation, especially the caste hierarchy which we observe in the Indian context. It was proposed by Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, the two eminent American sociologists, in 1945, that there was a path-breaking article entitled Some Principles of Stratification, where we find they discuss in at great length different kinds of stratification, the operation of stratification, the politics of stratification, the principle of stratification, and the Marxian perception also shows that the system of social stratification derives from the relationships of social groups to the forces of production. So it ultimately revolves around the ability or the power to control and dominate over the modes of production. So therein lies the continuous conflict between the different social groups. We find the producers, and on the other hand the upper class, the entrepreneurs, okay, the industrialists, the in a way the owners of the modes of production, and the producers, and the unequal sharing of rights, privileges, duties, and responsibilities. So social stratification is a major issue which leads to societal marginalization. In fact, it affects the growth of an individual, and it also affects the growth of a specific group or many such groups which are disempowered. In fact, I could refer to Dr. Ambedkar's observations on the Mahads, the ex-untouchable caste, the largest untouchable caste in Maharashtra. Mahads in military service. If you read Dr. Ambedkar's writings, if you follow his lecture, okay, at the Satyagraha, at Mahad Satyagraha, if you look at his speech, if you follow his speech, you would find that the Mahads were earlier recruited, okay, to military service, and how the Mahads had a kind of economic, okay, self-sufficiency because of their recruitment in military. Okay, in fact, Dr. Ambedkar's father was also in the military, but Dr. Ambedkar says that gradually the upper caste people, okay, the leaders of society, okay, gradually blocked any scope of the untouchable people, okay, to gain access to the military service. And that was a major cause for the large scale poverty of the Mahad community people. Okay, and how in a way blocking a major source of employment ultimately affected the economic health of the entire community. And spatial marginalization deals with the geographical infrastructure of a group. No, they are compelled to stick to isolation, and they are spatially marginalized. Okay, when I shall come to some very moving autobiographies by the nomadic tribal authors, okay, later, when I shall discuss them, you will come to understand how these ex-criminal tribes are still compelled to stick to isolation, how they are spatially, how they are geographically marginalized, how they are ghettoized. And in a way, if you make a cultural cartographic survey of these marginalized people in the Indian context, you would find that that space, no, space is a major issue of politics of space, okay, which is also a major politics of marginalization. So space and marginalization, denial of space, and the resultant marginalization, okay, are major developments in the context of the DNTs, of the nomadic tribes, which we have witnessed in the Indian context. And I once again refer to another definition of social stratification according to Raymond W. Murray, and a very famous American sociologist. I quote: social stratification is a vertical division of society into higher and lower social units. Okay, exactly this hierarchy, this vertical division is mentioned categorically by Dr. Ambedkar in his famous speech at Mahad, famous Satyagraha speech at Mahad. Okay, how Dr. Ambedkar says that there is almost a vertical order of Hindu caste-based society where Brahmins are at the top and the Shudras are at the bottom, and even below the Shudras are the Ati Shudras. Dr. Ambedkar says Ati Shudras, the Panchamas, the Dalits, who are beyond the purview of this socially discriminatory structure of Hindu society. So this higher and lower stratification, okay, is definitely a politics of marginalization. It's a politics of relegating to unimportant positions certain sections of society, okay, who are deliberately disempowered in order to construct a majoritarian discourse. Another, sociologist I have quoted here, according to Mike O'Donnell, okay, I quote, stratification is the division of society into hierarchically ordered layers. Look how O'Donnell categorically states that stratification is a division of society into hierarchically ordered layers. Okay, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, Ati Shudras. Members of each layer are considered broadly equal, but there is inequality between the layers. Yes, there is inequality, there is gap, there is discrimination. And Dr. Ambedkar says in that famous speech that the other, lower sections of Hindu society, okay, of that strata of Hindu caste-based society are not going to help the Dalits, the Atishudras in this revolution. Okay, the Kshatriyas won't help, the Vaishyas won't help, okay, the Shudras even won't help. And Dr. Ambedkar says that they are more concerned with maintaining a kind of status quo in, in society. They are more concerned about their own societal identity. Even if the Shudras are marginalized, they will not fight for the Ati Shudras. So this is a fight which the Ati Shudras have to fight, okay, all by themselves. So we find how this layering of society, this stratification of society is a major source of, marginalization, and how it is applicable to the Indian situation in the lived experiences of different marginalized sections of society. In India, no, intercaste dominance and marginalization. In India, social status is related to religious, purity and pollution. Yes, we have heard a lot about that. We have heard about, the Manu Sanghita. We have heard about the Manu code of conduct, and how the Hindu code of conduct in the name of the sage Manu, okay, was the root cause of the sufferings, pain and sufferings of, millions of marginalized people. And how we know that in 1927, on 25th December, Dr. Ambedkar and the other Satyagrahis, his followers, burnt, okay, the copies of Manusmriti, okay, Manusmriti Dahan Divas, okay, as a mark of, protesting against this, discrimination based on religion in the name of Hinduism, no, in the name of purity and pollution. So power is the primary basis of social inequality. A negative phenomenon. Power is a negative phenomenon which prevents others from their wishful act at will. Okay, it curbs the freedom of other, okay, hierarchically inferior sections of society. So Dalits, tribals, and others are dominated by the so-called superior class, where males are submissive. Where males are submissive, okay, we find that in the superior class, in a way, subjugates the males, okay, as bonded labor. They enslave them. But there is a very interesting case but among their own caste stratification, we find often these submissive males play the dominant role. In fact, if you read the Dalit women's autobiography, I'll be referring to some of them. Okay, we'll find that how the patriarchal discourse is continued even within the Dalit society. How the subjugated Dalit male in the upper caste world, okay, perpetuates the, the experience of subjugation, of dominance over women, okay, inside the Dalit social experience. The plight of women, okay, always marginalized in these social strata. In fact, we experience this in the literature, in the autobiographies of the nomadic and denotified tribes as well. So double marginalization. And I have just passingly referred to Simone de Beauvoir's quotation, one is not born but rather becomes a woman, because when we talk about marginalization, we are talking about certain sections, but at the same time, we should have a special focus on women, especially women of different Dalit and tribal communities of different marginalized groups, okay, who have to bear the brunt of patriarchal domination even within their own caste society. So marginalization is the theory of class and caste differentiation in society. Some of the branded castes, are put under a prejudiced surveillance from the police. Yes, that is what I'm going to talk about now. The branded castes, that is the former criminal tribes, how they are put under surveillance now. Even if they want to change their residence, change their position from one place to another, they need permission from the police. They need to report to the local police station at regular interval. They need to report everything, inform everything about their movements to the police. So look at the nature of bondage. Even in the 21st century, they face perpetual humiliation. I have also referred to another very eminent sociologist, Professor Park, that caste is a forced association. Caste is a forced association. Marginalization revolves around agency that discriminates, isolates, shames, and excludes subordinate groups on the basis of caste, religion, and gender. Caste related to birth and fixed in India. Yes, that is a major concern of Dalit intellectuals, that how the entire discourse of untouchability is related to birth is made congenital, that you are a born Dalit, you are a born untouchable, and you are bound to engage in the socially ignoble and ignominious, engage in socially ignoble jobs, in socially ignoble professions. You are bound to do that. So there is a kind of inescapable cycle of what we may call a kind of slavery, okay, which they have to experience. And the unorganized leadership of these lower castes, unorganized leadership, because this is the huge unorganized sector, okay, they are majority in terms of number, okay, but they are unorganized. So that is a major source of their suffering, okay, major source, because they cannot develop a very organized kind of resistance. We have seen it in the course of history, with some eminent exceptions, of course, but generally there had been a kind of subjugation and a kind of silent suffering which we have observed for many centuries. Marginality, and I have also brought in some other sociologists, social scientists. Marginality in social science, first introduced by this Robert Park, Professor Park, in 1928. The in-between two cultures which never fuse. And the whole theory was redefined by another sociologist, Janet Bennett, in her seminal work, Cultural Marginals, on the cultural marginals in 1993. Cultural marginals, the idea of cultural marginals was originally applied to the immigrants to the United States, particularly the ISKCON members, the young generation ISKCON members, immigrant members, and what were their experiences in the new alien culture, and how did they feel alienated, and what were the pangs of existence which they had to go through. Later, broadly, this term could be applicable to any other situation of cultural marginality. In fact, the idea of cultural marginality also includes the sense of culture shock. In fact, one predominant element of culture shock is self-shock, okay, which the individual experiences. And I think that Bama's realization, if you have read, Karukku, our first autobiographical work, if you have read Karukku, Bama's realization of caste-based discrimination in her ancestral village, where even older Dalit men are used as slaves by the upper caste Naikar young men, okay, and how they had to serve their young masters in a very brutally slavish manner. We have seen how all these activities completely disheartened Bama. She was shocked to find the nature and extent of these cruelties and these cruel practices upon Dalit people in her own village. So there is an element of self-shock, and we have realized, we have found these instances of self-shock in many other Dalit autobiographies. Say, for example, in Limbale, you will find it in Akkarmashi. You would find it in Amprakash Balmiki Jhutan. So individual sense of self and the environment around him, okay, we find that there is a yawning gap between that, and that creates a kind of culture shock. Okay, and the difficult discriminatory school experiences of Dalit authors as children. Yes, this is a major trope. If you read the Dalit autobiographies, say of Balmiki, or say or by any other Limbale, or even Bama, okay, if you read that, even if you refer to the experience of Dr. Ambedkar, no, if you read his autobiography, Waiting for a Visa, no, you would find there that how Dr. Ambedkar received the first shock as a student when he was not allowed to enter into the classroom. He was deliberately made waiting outside the classroom, and that was the place for the Dalit children. Okay, they didn't have access to inside the classroom. They didn't have access, and how they had to sweep and clean the classroom. That was part of their visit to the school, and they didn't have any opportunity to have drinking water when they felt thirsty if the peon, okay, was absent on that day. So you would find several such harrowing experiences of Dalit children in the classroom. Okay, the experience of shock. Okay, and if you read, one very important, Bengali Dalit drama, Ami Chuni Kotal Bolchi, the English translation of the experiences of Chuni Kotal, okay, who was the first, graduate of the Lodha community, once again, an erstwhile criminal tribe of Bengal, a member of Lodha community. If you read the English rendering of a play, a Dalit play, okay, based on Chuni's life, you would find that how brutally she was tortured in the school, and how disparagingly she was treated in the school for her thirst for knowledge. And look how there is a continuous reminder, okay, given by the upper caste teacher to such Dalit children that education is not meant for them. Okay, they are meant for scavenging, some ignoble jobs like scavenging and others. So there is a kind of majoritarian discourse which continually puts Dalit authors, okay, in a state of shock when they reminisce their harrowing experiences during their own school days. In fact, we also find that there is a conflict of cultures in the notion of cultural marginality. If opposing views of two cultural groups are greater, then the struggle for the cultural marginals is even tougher. We find it in the struggle, in the epic struggle of Ayan Kali, the first major, Dalit, the first major Dalit leader of an agrarian revolt against the upper castes rule in Kerala. The Malayalam leader, Ayan Kali, who led the movement against upper caste atrocities in Kerala in 19th century, late 19th century, and how it gained momentum in early 20th century. And how Ayan Kali became a symbol of protest, protest, Dalit protest. And you would find that the upper caste people were so scared of the access of Dalit children to the schools, that even after laws were formed by, even after acts were framed by the British government, what happened? One upper caste owner of a school, burnt down his own school overnight. When he heard that Ayan Kali would visit his school to get a Dalit girl admitted the next morning, that was his reaction. He burnt down his own school. So the fierce battle had always been there. There had been conflict of cultures, but such are once again exceptional cases. Otherwise, it had been a very monotonous, one-sided, saga of pain and suffering, for the Dalit people, and also the cultural homelessness felt by the marginals. Yes, so that is another experience. If you portray the exact situation of pain and suffering of your own community, what happens that the author, who portrays this experience, the author who is now in an urban setup, and now he or she writes about his or her own childhood experiences or early adulthood experiences. So that also becomes quite problematic, because the people, the community people, may not accept the quote unquote negative portrayal of them in the works of literature in the name of autobiography. So that creates another very important kind of development, another kind of embarrassment for the authors, Dalit authors, as Limbale himself has acknowledged in one of his interviews, how he was ostracized by his own villagers. He was not allowed to enter into his own village, as he had portrayed his mother, his family members, especially women of his community, as he talked frankly about their suffering, about their humiliation in the hands of the upper caste people. So that was not accepted. Even Bama was not allowed to enter her own village for 7 months, for a very frank portrayal of the experiences of pain and humiliation. I have also referred to, in a way, I have also referred to Duluz and Gathari, the seminal essay, the article, What is a Minor Literature, published way back in 1975. I have mentioned, or I have referred to this essay. It was written in the context of the works of Kafka, and it was definitely written in a context of linguistic use of the linguistic use of what we should call minor expressions in a major language, and how there was the idea of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, which we find Duluz and Gathari talk about. But I have found that the idea of minor literature, minor in the sense of using the language of the majority group, and rather being forced to use the language of a majority group, and retaining the identity of one's own minor language and using, the minor, dialectal variations abundantly in a major language is also, in a way, writing in a major language in a minor way. So mediating the minority group within a major language and society. In fact, if you look at the the writing of Bama, you would find that how she uses Tamil, okay, in a very innovative way, and how she uses many of her own, dialectal, components of her own, Dalit community, okay, in the Tamil language, how she experiments with language, the use of language. In fact, it is more apparent in the case of the nomadic authors. Okay, I will refer to some of them. Okay, how, they had a separate mother tongue, and they were in such a state of shame and public ignorance that they couldn't even accept, they couldn't even say that this is my mother tongue, okay, because of their the attachment to criminality, because of the disparaging attitude of the society towards them, and how they are forced to write in the major state language, mostly Marathi in their case. But while they write in Marathi, they construct their own diction. They make a free use of different expressions from their own mother tongue, from their own minor language. And in a minor literature, the second major characteristic which Duluz and Gathari talk about is that of the political element. Everything is political, because it is essentially, a literature of, assertion, literature of protest, literature of reclamation of identity. So connection of the individual to the political immediacy can always be found, and that we find in the writings of the Dalit authors. Okay, how the autobiography is not that of a Bama or a Limbale or a Balmiki. Okay, how it becomes, okay, also the autobiography of a community. Okay, so it has a collective value, okay, which we find in these, quote unquote minor literature. And another aspect which I have decided to highlight is the experience of these linguistic minorities, okay, particularly authors of these nomadic tribes. Okay, and I quote from Duluz and Gathari, how many people today live in a language that is not their own? Yes, in India, at least I can say at least more than 11 crore people live in a language that is not their own. And who are they? They are the, denotified tribes. Okay, they are the nomadic tribes. And by the 2001 census, we have come to know that they are, okay, they are more than 11 crore, or no longer, or not yet even know their own, and know poorly the major language. Yes, they know poorly the major language that they are forced to serve. They are forced to serve. Problem of minorities. And not knowing the major language can also be a kind of problem in terms of one's own identity, especially one's own indigenous identity. Okay, as you would find in the writings of Hasda Shobendra Shekhar. Okay, if you read Shobendra's interviews, you will find that many times he acknowledges that he was a medical practitioner. The English in which he prepared the first draft of his literary works was not accepted by the reputed publishing house, and he admits how the in-house editor almost completely transformed the the language of the narratives. So a question arises that ultimately, whose narrative is this? Ultimately, the experience may be there, but we know that language is a major, vehicle of communicating the experience. So if the language is, a borrowed one, a language in which the work is produced is a borrowed one, then whose work is this? Who can own this work? That is a major question. And now I come to the core section of my talk, that is people, the marginalized people about whom I have planned to talk about. Denotified 68 years ago, criminal tribes they still fight stigma, poverty. August 31st is celebrated as Liberation Day by the denotified nomadic tribes across India. Why? Because on August 31st, after independence, in 1952, they were denotified, officially denotified. But real freedom stays far-fetched as social stigma and systemic discrimination continue to affect people belonging to such tribes. If you read newspaper reports, the recent newspaper reports in connection with 31st August, because we have just left it 2 days ago, it was 31st August. So there had been many such reports on the denotified nomadic tribes across India. And what is their situation? I quote from the findings of Sudham Rathore, a PhD research scholar from Laman Banjara tribe. Yes, a denotified tribe, Laman Banjara of Maharashtra. Sudham observes, I quote, there is a stereotype against denotified nomadic tribes, DNTs, in police, media, society, and even some judges. Every member of this community is considered a criminal by the virtue of birth, and the stigma continues till they die. Stigma continues till they die, unquote. And you will be surprised to know, even a few years ago, the very famous police officer, Kiran Bedi, also made a public statement on the criminal professions of these denotified nomadic tribes. And there were many criticisms after her comment, and later she apologized for that, and she withdrew her comment. So there is a problem even in the 21st century, even in 2020, we find there is a problem. I refer to one landmark Supreme Court verdict in March 2019. The Supreme Court had set aside its own 2009 judgment and set 6 convicts free who were earlier sent to death row. It was the first of its kind ruling by the Supreme Court. And these people were convicted by multiple courts, including the apex court, in a famous rape and multiple murder case of Nashik district. The Supreme Court said the 6 men were falsely implicated and roped in by the police. All 6 of them, who spent 16 years in jail for a crime they never committed, belong to the nomadic tribes, formerly declared as, within quote, born criminals. So look at the element of marginalization and victimization of a sizable section of Indian population who still experience what we call pain and suffering, 16 years of pain and suffering without committing the crime. And these DNTs are the tribes which were notified as criminal tribes under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 by the British colonial government. Okay, and why were they branded as criminal tribes? Because they fought for their rights to forest products. Okay, they were the inhabitants of the forest. So they had a natural right over forest products. But the British, okay, evicted them from their own habitat, from the forest. As a result, they protested and they were branded as criminal tribes. Millions of them are there. Millions of them. In fact, in Bengal, we have, three, this previously called, erstwhile criminal tribes. Okay, the Lodhas, the Khadiyas, and the Dhikaros of Birbhum. And after decades of facing horrors of this racial act, they were denotified by the government of independent India on 31st August 1952. But look how, this was not a day of total celebration for the DNTs. Why? Because they were denotified. But once again, the Criminal Tribes Act was repealed only to be replaced by the Habitual Offenders Act. So there was another, mark of stigma. There was another mark of, criminality attached to their identity. In fact, in West Bengal, all of you must be aware of the Budhan Shabar case. Okay, you know how Budhan Shabar, okay, a member of the erstwhile criminal tribe, okay, Khediya Shabar, Budhan was tortured to death in the police custody for no offense, for no crimes. And this custodial death of Budhan created a huge furor, not only in Bengal, but also in other Indian states and even outside India. And we know the role of, author come activist late Mashweta Devi, okay, in finding out, justice for Budhan. And this Budhan, the sacrifice of Budhan, the tragedy of Budhan, okay, reached Gujarat, okay, particularly Ahmedabad, where there is a colony, there is a ghetto for another, erstwhile criminal tribe, Chara. And the Charas, okay, the first young graduate of the Chara tribe, Bajrang, Dakshin Bajrangi, okay, developed the idea of a theater of protest. And Budhan Theater was formed. Since 1998, Budhan Theater has performed plays to raise awareness about the conditions of many marginalized groups. One of their main goals is to, I quote, demonstrate that DNTs, denotified tribes, are not born criminals. They are humans with real emotions, capacities, and aspirations, unquote. The group was started after noted Bengali author, Mashweta Devi suggested that they make a play on the custodial death of Budhan Shabar in a West Bengal jail. So if we look at the status of these people, these DNTs, we find in 2007, the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination asked the Indian government to repeal the Habitual Offenders Act and rehabilitate them. In its concluding observation, okay, the UN committee expressed concern and stated that, I quote, the so-called denotified and nomadic, which are listed for their alleged criminal tendencies under the former Criminal Tribes Act 1871, continue to be stigmatized under the Habitual Offenders Act 1952. So we have continued in a way to perpetuate this tradition of victimization, of criminalizing a large section of Indian population. Even the National Commission for Denotified, Nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes, recommended reservations for them because they are quite arbitrarily allotted or rather pushed into different categories. In some places, STs, some cases SCs, and even in some cases OBCs. So there is absolutely no, clear-cut reason for the allotment of reservation to this vast group of denotified tribes. In fact, in the context of this coronavirus pandemic, we find that the DNTs, being one of society's most marginalized sections, are naturally one of the worst sufferers in this pandemic as well. Okay, some activists said that most of the members of this community survive hand to mouth and have no land. If you read the autobiographies of these nomadic authors, DNT authors, you would find the veracity of this observation. The ones who survive on their traditional professions, like performing arts, have no means to earn their bread in the lockdown period. And other restrictions which were imposed to curb the spread of the virus, they have spelled disaster to their livelihood options. In fact, I have been talking about the compulsion to write in a major language for these denotified tribe authors. And one such author, that is Dakshin Bajrangi, who belong to the Chara community. Their mother tongue is Bhatu. Bhatu is an indigenous language spoken by the Chara and other similar tribes. But this language is ignored by the government. So they cannot write in Bhatu. They have to write compulsorily in Gujarati or in Marathi or the dominant state language. In fact, I quote from Dakshin's observation. He says, I quote, "I have been successful in getting a number of prestigious national and international awards, but in the eyes of the lowest rank of constable, Dakshin Chara may not be anything more than a criminal," unquote. So this is the mindset of society. This is the attitude of the administration, even in 2020, towards these denotified tribes. The first, autobiography that I have mentioned here is entitled Uchalya. It's in Marathi title, Uchalya. The English translation is The Branded. It's by Laxman Gaikwad, who belongs to one of these denotified tribes. Laxman Gaikwad's book, The Branded, it's a very powerful social documentary on the trials and tribulations of the Uchalyas, the tribe classified as criminal by the British Raj. Even independence could not remove the social stigma of the Uchalyas. The exact English rendering of the word is pilfarers, the petty thieves. This nomadic denotified tribe undergoes inhuman treatment courtesy the law enforcement agencies. It clings to the thieving profession to survive, merely to survive. Otherwise, they have to starve to death. Gaikwad's autobiographical novel was written in Marathi. He had to write in Marathi. He couldn't use his own mother tongue. And it won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1998, translated into English by P.A. Polharkar. It's a major text. If you have any interest, you can read this autobiography to find out the nature and extent of suffering, humiliation. And I think that it's even a more oppressive kind of existence than the life experiences of some of the Dalit authors included in their autobiographies, because I have found that the plight of these nomadic tribes, denotified tribes, is even worse than the plight of many such Dalit communities. It was Gaikwad's luck that his father was a watchman anyway, and thereby he was exposed to the outside world. His father could desperately send him to school. Anyway, there were many embargoes, but his father fought against all the social taboos, especially his youngest son, Lakshman, this Lakshman Gaikwad. He hoped that he would somehow rise above the miserable plight of his own community. And he works as a cotton mill worker and gradually moves on to become a powerful trade union leader and a social worker, social activist. And Gaikwad describes a world where people survive on just water for 3 consecutive days. Nothing but water. And that is also, often, contaminated water. And where food comprises, cats, rats, roots, and leaves. And even for collecting leaves from, another man's, garden, okay, they are severely beaten up. Where life is abominably unhygienic. So they have to live with such, inconveniences. They have become part of their life. The indoctrination into the thieving profession, in fact, is carefully described by Gaikwad. And this autobiography, is quite candid, and it's really very difficult. We can understand, very difficult to share, the experience of this compulsive, profession of thieving. There are categories, classifications, and techniques in stealing, which seems to reach the form of an art. Okay, and how you will find a moving description of how a school-going boy anyway is compelled to accompany some of his community members to a fair, to a village fair, in order to initiate himself in the art of thieving. Okay, and how in the railway station, they have to pay a bribe, say of 300 rupees as advance, because the police constable knows very well that they are going to steal in the village fair. They will earn a booty, and so he claims a share beforehand. So everywhere, everywhere they are in chains. One has to commend Gaikwad's brutal honesty. The book is in some senses a soul purging exercise. Yes, a very cathartic experience where Gaikwad lays bare his pain. The author comes to terms with his excruciatingly painful past and the trauma of being born into a branded community. Yes, branded as criminals. And the D&T literature, another major autobiography, is by Lakshman Mane, Upara. Upara is again a Marathi word, which also means outsider. Upara. Is an autobiography by Lakshman Mane, a writer who lives in the state of Maharashtra, India. It has been translated into English by A.K. Kamat. And Arjun Dangle, a noted Dalit author and activist and theorist, sees it as a remarkable example of Dalit autobiography, but it is more than Dalit autobiography. In a way, D&Ts form a separate category by themselves. It's a very moving account of some tribes who were erstwhile criminal tribes. It finds mention in several encyclopedias of literature, and it's a path-breaking work in the domain of D&T literature. In fact, Lakshman Mane hailed from the Kaikadi community, an itinerant community of basket weavers, and this can be said to be the first piece of conscious literature from a person of a D&T. It traces the life full of strife of the boy who is the first one ever to go to a school in his community. And he's maturing into a politically aware social worker, and his inter-caste marriage, yes, to break down the caste barrier, and how it evoked a lot of uproar, and how it caused untold sufferings to his own community and other people as well. And I have mentioned here another autobiography by Kishore Shantabai Kale, the illegitimate son of Shantabai, a tamasha dancer from Kolhati community, another DNT community from Maharashtra, and a local politician, and how Kishore Kale was abandoned by his mother at a very young age, and how there was a tremendous struggle for him to survive. And the tamasha, which used to be a form of traditional folk dance, how we find from in this autobiography how it has degenerated to a kind of prostitution, and how the mother has to resort to prostitution. And growing up in an environment where such transactions were made daily, witnessing the wretchedness of such a life at close quarters and its repercussions on him, gave Kishore the will and the determination to free himself through education and an amazing strength to transcend the circumstances. We find the story of that struggle in his autobiography. In fact, it's also a major work in the domain of DNT literature. And another one entitled Tanda by Atmaram Rathod, who belonged to the Banjara tribe, is also a very soul-searching kind of autobiography, which showcases the excruciating pain and suffering in the life of the author. And I quote from Atmaram Rathod's writing, "I do not have a birthplace in the conventional sense. The place where I was born was known as Tanda." So it's a story of uncertainty regarding one's existence, one's place of stay, a continual state of placelessness, a state of migration. And I have also anyway recorded some other autobiographies. I had included some slides on Dalit autobiographies as well as examples of literature of the marginalized people. But anyway, I think that I have somehow run out of my time. And Amit, should I stop at this point of time, and can we have some interaction?
We need to have a Q&A session, but if you want to go on for 5 minutes, maybe you may sum up the discussion. If you so
Okay. No, actually, I had a very long presentation. In fact, I discussed first the literature of the nomadic tribes, the denotified tribes, and then I have attempted to discuss the experience of marginalization in some of the most representative Dalit autobiographies. Okay, I have mentioned Baburao Bagul, When I Hid My Caste, the compulsions of hiding one's caste in modern urban society, and the resultant pain and suffering of hiding one's caste identity, and how what Baburao Bagul recorded in 1963 is still relevant in the 21st century. I have also included, Baby Kamble's seminal autobiographical work, The Prisons We Broke, Jena Amuchi, in Marathi, The Prisons We Broke, and how it was the first work that comes in Dalit literature written by a woman. And we find how there is a new perception about the sufferings of Dalit women of certain untouchable sects in Maharashtra here. And Baby Kamble's is a pioneering work which unfolds the experiences of untouchable women and many details, many harrowing details of their sufferings, and also the patriarchal domination in their own caste. I have also included Aidan, The Weave of My Life by Urmila Power, another major Dalit autobiography by a woman author from Maharashtra, and how it's a symbolic, Aidan is a symbolic, presentation. Okay, the Marathi generic term for all things made from bamboo, and how the act of weaving of her mother and her act of writing are organically linked. Okay, the weave of pain, suffering, and agony that links all of them. And Urmila Power later turned into a full-scale activist, author come activist. But in this autobiography, we have found the trials and tribulations of the untouchable women, especially from the Konkan coast in northern Maharashtra. And I have also mentioned Hasda Shobendra Shekhar, the Adivasi will not dance. I included a couple of slides on the Adivasi will not dance. And in fact, I referred to one story, They Eat Meat, how it is about a Santal family that moves to Vadodara, Gujarat in early 2000, where the undercurrent of communal violence, how it lurks throughout the story, as the Soren family, a Santal family, is forced to quit eating meat so as to not upset the sentiments and caste purity of their neighbors. And how there is a story of the tribals, okay, who are in a different state, in a different culture, and against the backdrop of the Godhra riot, how we find that the Santal family protects a minority, family, a Muslim family, and how with the help of the same utensils, which are generally used to cook pure vegetarian food. So the harrowing experience of marginalization is recorded through different narratives, autobiographical narratives and also some fictional narratives. And Hasda Shobendra Shekhar is definitely a new, refreshing voice, particularly in the context of the Austric tribes of the Chotanagpur Plateau, because probably his is the first voice in the contemporary, indigenous literature from the Chotanagpur Plateau, a writer who writes in English, although not absolutely his own English, but yet one who records his experiences of marginalization in English. And I have also included the tribal situation in the Northeast because that is a major area of both, cultural and territorial marginalization, a spatial marginalization, and how there is a vital sense of disconnect from the ancestral culture as an impact of colonialism, and how they had to embrace new language and new religion. In fact, in the Northeast, we find that the British colonizers and the American missionaries left behind a large number of converted people and who were trapped between the worlds, skeptical of their own indigenous identity, and how the Nagas were segregated. Oh, if we look at the geographical, area of the Northeast, we find how the Nagas, as a very large community, tribal community, were divided into many, minor sects and spread over many states in the Northeast, and how no inherent unity of the Naga tribes could be observed, and in a way, how both the Westerners and the Indian state even were colonizers in the Naga context. I have put forward these observations for your deliberation, for your way reading, for your greater sense of engagement with the autoethnographic writings by the northeastern authors. Their literary attempts to reclaim identity through literary writings, how autoethnography of Naga scholars is aimed at reclaiming identity. I have referred to some major voices, indigenous voices like Easterin Kire, Jasmine Patton, Temsulao, and others. who challenged the colonial stereotype of the Nagas as wild savages, and how the Naga writers in English, writing in English, they try to revive the oral culture for their cultural reclamation, oral literature, folk literature, and how they use it in their English writing, and how Nagas had been the victims of linguistic imperialism, how there was also a social stratification based on people with a knowledge of English and people without the knowledge of English, and how the Christian mission was responsible for the decay of the Morang culture. I have discussed all these issues. I have in a way included all these issues for discussion, and the idea of Orientalism, the resistance movement by the Nagas in the Northeast. And I have also mentioned Ishtarin Kire's a seminal work, Son of the Thunder Cloud, and Ishtarin Kire's persistent claim to decolonize the post-colonial. In fact, we find it in the writings of some other new generation writers like Jasmine Patton. In Jasmine Patton's writing, we find a reference to Ishtarin Kire and her call for decolonizing the post-colonial, and how it, in a way, overlaps with G.N. Devi's idea of cultural amnesia as an appropriate rendering in the understanding of the loss of stories, and how loss of stories with the advent of colonization also creates a kind of cultural demoralization, a sense of cultural amnesia, forgetfulness of one's own, oral heritage. And there is a kind of alien value structure and how it affects the indigenous, identity, indigenous traditions. And there is a disorder. Okay, I have quoted from Devi also how this disorder manifests itself in the form of cultural repressiveness and amnesia, projecting static images of the past, inaccurate and inflexible concepts of literary traditions and history, and non-productive affinities with remote but idealized traditions. Okay, all are in a way symptoms of this disorder. Okay, and how they attempted, the indigenous authors writing in English have attempted to set their own land in order, okay, save them from this disorder. Okay, and I have made some, a brief literary surveys of their engagement with, indigenous oral traditions, narrative traditions, in their writings. So, in a way, marginalization is experienced in a different way in the conflict between the oral versus the written, the oral and the written, in the writings of Temsula Au, also a very senior, Naga author from the Au community, and her comparison with the African, tribal writing. And I have passingly, referred to, disability studies because, frankly speaking, this is not my domain of, specialization, but I have definitely found that some Indian English writings and also some writings in Indian Bhasha literature can definitely be cited as dealing with the issues of, disability, disabilities in different, manifestations, in different incarnations, different interpretations of disability as third dimension, and many other, associated, theoretical formulations, the actual experience of disability, and how the othering of the disabled people is also an example of marginalizing, a number of a section of Indian population, and how all these things in a way constitute the vast, domain of the literature of the marginalized. And more or less, I have stopped with these observation. There are other areas of marginalization. I admit that all of us know that, but in a way that requires, some more time some greater attention to the details of these domains of research and writing, and that would definitely, demand many more lectures. And I hope that this online lecture series would address these different types of, marginality or marginalization, and would definitely try to, make it as inclusive as possible in course of the future presentations by other scholars. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to make my presentation here. Okay, I'm really indebted to the Department of English, University of Gurgaon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Indranil Acharya, for this brilliant presentation. It's a detailed presentation, it has been. And having worked myself on marginality studies, I think I was being fascinated by your presentation of this particular aspect of marginalization, because you were talking about two particular factors of marginalization, namely caste and also a kind of a perception of caste. When you were talking about the criminal tribes, the denotified tribes, the nomadic tribes, a new vista of marginalization was being opened to us. You know, we all know that marginalization, the margin is basically part of a binary structure where in center and margin cannot exist without each other, because this positionality is always dynamic and multi-causal. A static approach to marginalization that has often been the bane of academia. You have, through your presentation, tried to correct this particular misrepresentation and misperception of the factor of marginality. And because you have not only talked about the representation of marginality and the marginalized, but also the representation of marginality in the literature of the marginalized, the authors, the groups that have suffered marginalization in their person and also in their presence, makes this presentation not only immediate but also intimate in many ways. So I think I must now throw open the session for comments and queries by the august audience. So if you have any questions to ask or observations to put forward, feel free to go forward.
Yes, Amida, some questions have already come in, so I can just read out those questions. Thank you, Dr. Acharya, for your wonderful talk. I'm Shomipendra
Thank you,
Banerjee.
Shomipendra. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So the first question, actually, I got disconnected. But the first question was from Mithun Bormon, which, as far as I remember, was about the relation between, or I mean, he was basically asking whether Dalit literature and the literature of the marginalized are the same things, or is there any difference between them?
Okay.
I hope, Mithun, I have put it correctly.
No, actually, Mithun, thank you for your question, but I hope you have been through my lecture and you followed my lecture. So by this time, you have
Yes.
definitely found, an answer to your question, that Dalit literature is definitely part of the literature of the marginalized, but Dalit literature alone does not constitute the whole corpus of the literature of the marginalized in the Indian context. Okay, because we cannot we cannot in a way broadly describe, okay, all the literature of the marginalized people in the Indian context as Dalit. Okay, there is a kind of, there is a kind of problem in making such sweeping generalizations. Okay, although we know that there are many Dalit writer activists, okay, who want to use this term on a broad-based manner, in a broad-based way, okay, to describe any kind of, literature by the marginalized people as Dalit. No, but that is not really the experience of, different sections of marginalized people. No, because Dalit also has its own, context, its own origin, its own development, its own, what I should have said, ontological, meaning. Okay, so from that point of view, all the literature of the marginalized cannot be described as Dalit.
Yes. The next question is from Tomal Ghosh. He's basically asking what role has the tribal traditions and folkloric cultures do they have in the development of the aesthetics of Dalit literature? So their cultures, their
Tribal culture
rituals.
and folkloric traditions.
Yes.
Folkloric traditions. No, that is a point of, dispute, because that is an area of, I think, area of inadequate representation. Inadequate in the sense that if you follow the aesthetics of towards an aesthetic of Dalit literature by Sharan Kumar Limbale, or if you follow the Hindi work Dalit Sahitya ke Saundarya Sastra by Om Prakash Valmiki, no, if you follow these books on Dalit aesthetics, you will find that that there is a relative silence on the issue of incorporating tribal experience into Dalit aesthetic experience. Okay, there is no separate mention of tribal culture. Okay, if you follow the chapters of towards an aesthetic of Dalit literature, you won't find any specific separate discussion on tribal culture. Okay, so that is one what we should call an absence. That is one absence which is quite conspicuous. Another thing, folkloric traditions. In Dalit aesthetic tradition, there is a role of, there is a vital presence of folklore, because Dalit communities have their own folkloric traditions. For example, if you follow, Aidan by Urmila Power, if you look at the title, if you look at the profession of the untouchable community, okay, of preparing artifacts out of bamboos, okay, and if you look at the handicrafts, okay, the Aidan, the title, you will find that it has its own lore. So it's based on a kind of community lore. Okay, if you look at the title of, say, Bama's Karukku, if you look at the meaning of the Tamil word Karukku, its association with a certain kind of Dalit experience of resistance, of anger, of retaliation. Okay, if you look at the association, you will find that these are all part of Dalit lore. Okay, so folklore is definitely a part of Dalit aesthetic. In fact, that is included in the discussion of Dalit aesthetic. And we find in many of the Dalit autobiographies, in fact, most of the Dalit autobiographies, deal with certain, folk engagement with different kinds of lores, rituals, superstitions, supernatural engagements, okay, and many other things. In fact, how, ghosts and goblins, how they become an integral part of, community folklore, community belief system. Okay, so folkloric traditions have been incorporated into Dalit aesthetic, and we have found abundant, instances of such use of folkloric traditions in Dalit autobiographies. Okay, but I feel that tribal culture okay, is not in a way represented or in a way integrated into the experience of Dalit aesthetic in a major way. So if Dalit author activists want to really Dalitize the tribal experience of marginalization, okay, they have to think in a new way, and they have to find out new ways of including tribal culture into Dalit aesthetic.
Yes, thank you. And I think this is the last question from Orup Mondol, who is asking a very interesting question as the politics of representation in the portrayal of Dalit women by Dalit men. So a feminist angle within the Dalit literature itself.
That is a very interesting question. Thank you, Arup. Okay, I hope you have followed my lecture, and there were already clues given in my lecture. I have mentioned, categorically how there had been duplication, or rather replication of the patriarchal discourse in the Dalit society as well. And I have mentioned how the subjugated male in the context of upper caste domination, okay, assumes a dominant role, okay, in the context of the Dalit familial situation, and how the subjugated male in the outside world becomes a torturing male inside the home, and how for the Dalit woman, okay, it's not only an excruciating experience of pain and suffering in the hands of the upper caste male, it is also a continuous saga of receiving physical, mental, spiritual, and existential threats from the male members of their own family, from their own community. In fact, I would advise you to read, one excerpt in English from Dalit autobiography included in an anthology, Listen to the Flames, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. It's an autobiography entitled, Mere Bachpan Mere Kandho Par. Okay, Mere Bachpan Mere Kandho Par, and it's written by Shivraj Singh Bechan. Shivraj Singh Bechan is a Dalit author. He is a professor of Hindi literature at the University of Delhi. Okay, Shivraj writes a very shocking and moving account, an autobiography, his own autobiography, Mere Bachpan Mere Kandho Pe, and there he narrates an experience of of brutal violence upon his own mother. His mother being beaten up severely by his father and uncle. Okay, why? Because he had stolen only 1 rupee coin from his uncle's pocket in order to buy pencil and notebook from a nearby store. And he didn't confess. And the father and uncle thought that the mother must have stolen the coin. And what was the result? The result was a continuous drubbing of a woman in her own home for 2 days. And she was almost senseless. Okay, it was a graphic, account of, brutal violence. Okay, no human rights, nothing, absolutely nothing, and absolutely shocking details of torture. Now, this was not perpetrated by an upper caste male. Okay, this was done by her own relatives, her own family members. Okay. And it has been the experience of many other women, especially of the nomadic tribes and the denotified tribes. If you read Lakshman Mane Zupara, if you read The Branded, okay, Achule by Lakshman Gaikwad. Okay, you will find similar, episodes of violence perpetrated on Dalit women by Dalit men, their own relatives.
Yes, so shocking indeed. I mean, the way you have told these
Yes,
stories, these have touched us in numerous ways.
yes.
Anyway, I mean, two more questions have come up in between. Can we take these? Uh,
Let's hurry up. Okay.
yeah.
If Indonesian doesn't object, we can take them.
Hello.
So yeah, Indranil, two more questions have come up basically. So can we take these? Yeah, okay, briefly, these are about the nomenclature. I think it's quite interesting about what do we understand by Dalit literature. The first is
Yes,
by Oshit Bishwas, who is
yes,
asking if upper caste authors write on Dalit issues, then is that
yes.
Dalit literature? That
Mm,
is one. And I will give the second question as well.
mm.
Is it derogatory? Is Dalit literature, the term Dalit literature, is it derogatory to refer to the marginalized section of the society, or is it, a kind of a symbolic reassertion of identity? This is a question by Shayon Padial.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Ashit and Shan, for two wonderful questions, very good questions. Now I answer to the first question. If upper caste authors write about Dalit experience, okay, can it be described as Dalit literature? In fact, in answer to this question, I would request you to refer to the resolution number 5, taken in the first literary conference of Dalit authors in 1958. In the first Dalit literary conference, okay, we found that, okay, there were a series of resolutions adopted to define and describe Dalit literature. And there, in resolution number 5, it was clearly written that even literature produced by the upper caste, that is non-Dalit writers, about Dalit people should be regarded as Dalit literature. So, by referring to their own resolution, okay, we can say that the writings of Mashweta Devi can also be described as Dalit literature. Okay, from that experience, writings of other writers like, say, Shoikat Rokhit, okay, for his novel, say, Nachni, we can describe it as a Dalit novel. So, that is one point which I think can be safely answered by referring to the resolution itself. But if we look at the whole discourse of politics of representation, okay, who can be a Dalit author? Okay, who is a non-Dalit writer? What is Dalit literature? Is it only literature written by the Dalit people? Okay, can't a non-Dalit author write something which is essentially, okay, indicative of Dalit experience? Now, I think that there is debate, and there are many Dalit authors who consider that non-Dalit writers can never write about Dalit experience because they lack what they call Dalit consciousness, Dalit chetona, in Bengali chetona. So consciousness, okay, can only be, experienced by a person who is a born Dalit. So that is one of the, many theories, being circulated around the definition of Dalit literature. Okay, but I can refer to the resolution number 5 of the first Dalit literary conference, and I can say that yes, even non-Dalit writers writing about Dalit life, okay, can also be described as, Dalit literature. And the second question, what is the second question? Derogatory, yes. Derogatory, look, whether it's derogatory or whether it is empowering, no, it's It's a matter of pride. Okay, it's a matter of solidarity, expression of solidarity. I think that should be decided by the Dalit authors themselves. Okay, because Dalit in a way is a term that was coined and popularized by, I think, the great Dalit stalwarts, ideologues and theoreticians, okay, activists like Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, Dr. Baba Sahib Bhimrao Ambedkar, okay, and many others. And in fact, if you look at the movement of Dalit Panthers, okay, how you find that, the term Dalit was, an integral, symbol of, empowerment, of resistance, of, solidarity, of a kind of, concerted, okay, movement for resistance. So in a way, Dalit is very much a political, term. Dalit is very much a term which denotes, political consciousness. So whether it's derogatory, I think will be decided by the authors who don't want to associate themselves with the term Dalit, who don't want to. There are some, we know that, because when we were preparing the first anthology of Bengali Dalit stories, survival and other stories, in fact, we had to exclude, we had to drop one story by a woman writer, okay, a Dalit woman writer, who withdrew her story at the last moment because she didn't want to associate herself with the term, Dalit. So we had to drop it, and that went against us, because there was a charge against the first anthology of Bengali Dalit stories, that there was no female writer. Okay, it was an all male show. We attempted to include one female voice way back in 2010. It was published in 2012, but the process began in 2010. But we missed her because she didn't want to associate herself with the term Dalit. So it's a choice of, it's an individual choice. Okay, and for most of the authors, if we look at the history of the origin and development of the term Dalit, for most of the authors, it has been a symbol of empowerment. Okay, and it has become such an all-pervasive term that even Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, while writing the epilogue to her translated work, Choti Munda and his Arrow, the original work by Mahashweta Devi, while she was writing that epilogue, the last sentence of her epilogue says that Birsa Munda can be described, Birsa Munda and his resistant movement can be described with the help of only one term, that is Dalit. So Dalit has gained immense, circulation and popularity over the last few decades.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, we have come to the end of the questions. Thank you, Indranil, for answering them with such, detailed perception. And I mean, I can't resist. I know we are late slightly, but I can't resist, adding that whatever you have said today, and the kind of, the politics and the nodes that you have, opened up regarding the representation, regarding consciousness, regarding experience. I mean, these are wonderful material, and this is where work should be done. And for the researchers, future researchers, these are the areas that need to be picked up. I mean, you see, the what you just mentioned. I mean, women authors, or the way patriarchy is working, even in Dalit writings. So there are numerous areas that need to be picked up. I mean, I was also just one little thing. I was also, I have in these lockdown days been watching so many films on various platforms. I came across some films which were actually looking at these denotified tribes in a very dark light, and I was shocked to find that. I mean, a colonial construction or a colonial structure which is how these Hindi films stereotype, the criminal motives into the tribes, and how ingrained those still are in our cultural imaginary. I mean, these needs to be questioned, and these need to be, analyzed as well. So,
Exactly.
and that's it. Yeah, Amita, you can take it over from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Shobit
Well,
Chandra.
well, I must thank everybody concerned, for this brilliant session, very vibrant, that has produced immense heat and light. And I hope this will lead us to think on about the nuances that have been put forward and opened up by Indranil Acharya. I was being reminded of two things. Number one, that marginalization and marginality is always multi-causal, and that has actually led to the development of one particular field of study called intersectionality studies. Because from Peterson and Rutherford, we know that about the concept of double colonialization. So here also in Dalit writings, we have to understand that along with caste issues, along with ethnic issues, gender and sexuality are issues that are never inactive, that are never dormant. So these things will always crop up, and the domain of the Dalit women will always be further vitiated by the aspersions and oppressions of patriarchy. So I must thank the audience for putting very interesting questions to Indranil, and I must thank Indranil for answering them with patience and perspicacity. So we have come to the fag end of this session. But before we end, I must invite all present to the next session that we are going to organize. We are going to bring to you another session, another lecture by Professor Shamsad Murtuza from University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh on 5th instant. He is going to talk about post-war British poetry. So I would like to invite you all to join us then. And with this, we come to the end of this session by thanking our speaker for the day, Professor Indranil Acharya, for being with us and sharing with us his many insights. Thank you, Indranil.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you.